I'm Constantine Kanakasta, Director of the Center for the Sustainable Built Environment. On behalf of the Center and the NYU Shack Institute, I would like to welcome you very much to this first annual Sustainable Conference on Sustainable Real Estate, I should say. This year's theme is Building the Smart City, which reflects the critical importance of innovative strategies for the design, development, and management of the urban built environment. So the question here today is really, what is a smart city? And that's what we have our speakers here to discuss and to explore. But essentially, a smart city analyzes data collected through integrated systems and uses that information to improve decision making. It's a living laboratory where urban technologies that address all major city functions, so transportation, energy, water, buildings, waste, public space, economic development, are researched, deployed, and tested as new innovations are constantly being developed. From energy storage devices that harness the power of renewable systems, to building codes and financial mechanisms, to an electrical grid that responds to energy demands. The success of these innovations is reliant on effective integration across industries, systems, and technologies.
There's really no question of where we stood on the idea.
His personal and professional commitment to envisioning and building this smart city,
to the importance of emerging technologies and what we do,
must take
and
a
to the
leadership
importance
role
of
in making this
interdisciplinary work
reality.
has positioned the Shack Institute as a leader
what are
not
we
just
seeing?
in real estate
Globally, we're
finance
seeing
and
convergence
development,
around
but
the
also
Kyoto Protocol
sustainability
standards
and
and
international
calls
work,
to aggressively address
and now
climate change
through
through
the
greenhouse
Dean's
gas
own efforts
emissions
through the Clinton
reductions.
Global Initiative.
In the U.S., as most of you are quite aware, buildings make up about 39% of emissions. But where many saw green building as a passing fad, perhaps a byproduct of overcapitalized developers and their design teams, we now see a broad-based and widespread commitment to sustainability. The U.S. federal government, for example, has made significant investments in the clean economy and energy efficiency as well. Over $80 billion from the stimulus funds going to these areas, as well as regulations now of greenhouse gas emissions by the EPA through the Clean Air Act, and most recently, the Better Buildings Initiative, which specifically targets commercial real estate and provides incentives for owners who want to invest in their buildings. It is our cities, though, where the real innovation is happening. Competition among cities is now expanded into the vernacular of carbon reductions, quality of life issues, and environmental standards, and universal policies that require greater energy efficiency in buildings and infrastructure are only a matter of time. In my research, actually, of about 200 of the largest U.S. cities, almost one-third now have policies relating to green building standards. Almost all have been adopted in just the past few years, as you can imagine, and this signifies an unprecedented new role for the public sector in advancing sustainable real estate. In New York, there's really no question that the Bloomberg administration has been a leader in this charge. While San Francisco, Chicago, Seattle, and other cities have implemented their own environmental and efficiency goals, New York City really has been at the forefront of policy innovation. The Greener Greater Buildings Plan, for example, now requires energy auditing and benchmarking, with the first deadline, as many of you are also aware of, coming up in May. And the new Energy Efficiency Corporation will help to fund commercial retrofits and increase access to capital for building owners looking to make new energy efficiency investments. So much attention has been placed on buildings and infrastructure because they are a critical foundation of the smart city and a key driver of economic competitiveness, social equity, and environmental sustainability. For the real estate industry, we really stand at a turning point. The possibility now exists for us to transform the way real estate decisions are made, how buildings are designed and constructed, and how we impact the cities in which we build. In the midst of an economic downturn that's affecting all of us, there is reason for optimism, and I believe a renewed enthusiasm in our profession as well. Innovation happens when change occurs, when challenges emerge, and when there is a collective realization that there has to be a better way of doing things. And real estate developers have always been innovators, from the skyscrapers of the late 19th century to the eco-cities of today. The opportunity for new innovation now is at a peak, spurred by the collective goals of increasing investment in economic opportunity, creating new jobs, and protecting our environment. The barriers to building a smart, sustainable city are significant but not insurmountable. In emerging markets like China and India, concerns are driven by governance issues, land use policies, and infrastructure capacity. It is the pace and scale of new construction, both buildings and even whole cities, that creates challenges to sustainable growth. For example, by 2025, China is estimated to have 220 cities with populations of 1 million or more, almost 7 times that of Europe. Of those cities, there will be 25 with populations of 5 million or more. To give you a sense of the pace of construction in Shanghai, 65% of the buildings over 500 feet have been built since have been built since the year 2000. And in New York City, the number is less than 20%. And in absolute terms, Shanghai is even beating us in these tall buildings as well, building 49 in the past 10 years to our 42. This growth means that carbon emissions in China will double by 2030. And recently, there's been a focus on kind of the flashy urban visions of Masdar and Nusongdo as examples of the smart city. But the realities of urbanization require that we also find practical, replicable solutions. In advanced economies, post-industrial cities are faced with the growing problem of an aging building stock and failing infrastructure. In New York City, like many cities across the US and Europe, our commercial buildings average over 50 years old, and our primary infrastructure was built at the end of the 19th century. Here, retrofitting our existing buildings and infrastructure is necessary to maintain competitiveness for a 21st century global economy. And it is a tremendous economic opportunity as well. In the US, building retrofits has been estimated to be a $400 billion market, which can create jobs and catalyze new businesses, as well as reducing energy use by at least 20 to 25% with current technologies. These cities have all of the elements needed to become more sustainable. They have robust markets, they have stable governance, and a growing awareness of resource constraints. But barriers remain in the form of limited access to capital, unproven policy interventions, and difficulties in changing human behavior. While there are challenges, there are countless real-world examples of overcoming these barriers and impressive new innovations, represented by the leaders you will hear from today. The purpose of this conference is to move the discussion on smart cities forward, to better understand the constraints we face, to build on the success of innovators in the industry, and to foster new ideas and innovations by bringing together a diversity of expertise that is necessary to achieve a more sustainable future. Today, we hope to stimulate interaction among those who typically do not share the stage: academics and industry leaders, researchers and practitioners, government and private sector, to begin to shape an urban sustainability agenda built on the belief that the only way to achieve our shared goals will be through shared solutions. We must move beyond the current way of thinking to develop innovations in policy, in financial mechanisms, in new technologies that will allow us to build markets around energy efficiency, accelerate the deployment of new technologies, and efficiently allocate limited public resources. So the Center for the Sustainable Built Environment was officially launched just 1 year ago, and it was created to provide this multidisciplinary, collaborative platform from which to foster these types of innovations in the real estate and construction industries. To achieve these goals, the center is supported by an industry advisory board, a faculty committee that now represents 10 schools and programs from across NYU, and is supported by a very robust and dedicated group of students through our Student Alumni Committee. We've been active in three areas, which are our education programs through our new sustainable development concentration and other intensive programs that we've been launching. Our research has been robust, working with the UN, working as partner with Columbia and CUNY and NYU Poly and the Urban Technology Innovation Center, partnering up with the Department of Buildings and other city agencies for relevant policy and financial mechanism research, as well as working with NYU, our folks here at the Office of Sustainability, and trying to make our own building stock a bit greener. So in the interest of time, I'll just jump to start our today's program, but before I do, there's of course a number of people to thank and acknowledge that made today possible. First, of course, I would like to thank our speakers coming from across the US and Europe to share their expertise and lend their perspective to today's discussion. I'd also like to thank our sponsors who were instrumental in making today possible and bringing all of us together here. The Royal Institution of Chartered Surveyors, IBM, Capsis Corp., Trinity Real Estate, Newmark Knight Frank, and Forest City Ratner Companies. I would also be remiss not to thank our own NYU SHAC team, led by Jessica Estrada Watson, our Associate Director of Marketing Events, who was just fantastic in pulling all of this together. Fran Brooks, Milton Scudder, and Catherine Green, who all lended tremendous support over the past few months to make this a reality. And of course, we wouldn't be here today without the great leadership here at NYU. So I would like to thank Dean Lappner for his continued support and recognition of the importance of sustainability in the field of real estate. And last but not least, NYU SHAC Dean Stuckey, whose leadership and vision has been nothing short of transformative for the Institute. About 1.5 years ago or 2 years ago, when I presented the idea for the center and the concept to Dean Stuckey when he took the helm, There was really no question of where he stood on the idea. His personal and professional commitment to responsible development, to the importance of emerging technologies in what we do, and to the importance of interdisciplinary work has positioned the Shack Institute as a leader not just in real estate finance and development, but also sustainability and international work. And now through the Dean's own efforts with the Clinton Global Initiative and many others in the area of post-catastrophe reconstruction and redevelopment. Just briefly on Dean Stuckey, of course, his career, I think many of you are quite aware, but he's been nothing short of prolific, having built over 50 commercial and residential and industrial buildings here in New York City worth over $25 billion, both from the private and the public sector side. Private from Forest City Ratner, and on his public sector work as president of New York City Economic Development Corporation under the Koch administration. Of course, he continues his dedication to public service today as president of the Public Design Commission, and it is with great pleasure that I welcome Dean Stuckey to the stage.
Thank you very much, Constantine. I'm going to be brief because I'd like to get us back on schedule, because I know some people who are on panels are actually flying out, some are flying in, so we're trying to accommodate their schedules. I'd like to thank first and foremost Dean Lappiner, who, when I came to Shack a year ago, basically agreed that he would give us the tools and the authority we needed to create what we hoped would become the best real estate institute in the world, and I think we're well on our way to doing that, and that couldn't have happened without his support. He is imaginative, he's creative, he secretly is an interior designer and developer. We all know that, and he is incredibly sustainable, both as a leader and his way of going about our business. I also would like to thank Constantine, our newest PhD, which we should all give him a round of applause, because somehow, and I think I work long hours, but somehow this guy managed to have a child, have a PhD, create a center, and get us involved in about 13 or 14 studies that we were not involved in before, and exhibit tremendous leadership as a way of demonstrating where, in fact, the Institute can go in the area of sustainable development and entrepreneurial development. Constantine also teaches, of course, in entrepreneurial development, which is one of our most popular classes as well. The Institute is healthy, it's in good shape, and it's growing continually. As Constantine mentions, we have robust programs in real estate finance as well as real estate development and construction management. Over the last year, we did develop new disciplines in real estate development, in sustainable development, the business of development, which includes entrepreneurial development, as well as global development, and we've been able to recruit and attract both great students and great faculty to our institute. The work that we're doing is helping to shape the way new development is thought about. When we talk about sustainable development and when we talk about green development, we're no longer just talking about how can you take a building and retrofit it to reduce the energy. We're now talking about working with some of the greater engineering and other schools who are producing more scientific and additional ways of making buildings sustainable. We're looking at, particularly in New York City, the older building stock, because for every one building that may be sustainable that's built new, we have 500 million square feet of space here that's probably 40 or 50 or more years old, where we need to look at how do we do creative things to bring the carbon footprint of those buildings down. And we are working with industry as well. It's been the hallmark of Shack since its inception to work not just simply with the academic side of the equation, but to work with the academics in a way of bringing things clinically to the built environment that we function within. And so with professors like Professor Conacosta and Professor Hirsch, and we have Rosemary Scanlon here, our academic director, and others who will be here throughout the day, we continue to try and marry both the academic side of the equation with the built environment side of the equation. And I'm very proud to work with such great people and feel that everything that we do right is a result of them. So let me now, if I can, just to keep us going, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Edward Glaser. Dr. Glaser is the Fred and Eleanor Glimp Professor of Economics in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences at Harvard University, where he has taught since 1992. He is a director of the Taubman Center for State and Local Government and the director of the Rappaport Institute of Greater Boston. He regularly teaches microeconomic theory and occasionally urban and public economics. He has published dozens of papers of cities, economic growth, and law and economics. In particular, his work is focused on the determinants of city growth and the role of cities as centers of idea transitions and transmission. He received his PhD from the University of Chicago in 1992. I'd like to welcome Dr. Glaser and also say that for those of you who are interested after his talk, he is selling his book at the back of the room, and I'm sure he'd be happy to sign it with you with some clever new ideas. Dr. Glaser, may I introduce you to the panel?
Is the thing up? Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction, and I'm really delighted to have the opportunity to speak to you today about the material in my new book. Let's see, Triumph of the City. Now, current events in Cairo remind us of a remarkable thing that's happened in the world. It's been called the Facebook revolution, and there's no doubt that new technologies helped make this happen. But it wouldn't have happened unless people had actually taken to the city streets. They couldn't have just toppled Mubarak by blocking him from their Facebook pages. They actually had to transform the city and come to the city to actually affect this political change. That, to me, is symbolic of a larger trend throughout the world, which is that new technologies, electronic connections, the ability to telecommunicate across the globe, all of these forces are making cities more, not less important. We see the rise of cities in many different ways. We see it in the astonishing connection between income and prosperity. On average, those countries that are more than 50% urbanized are 4 times wealthier than those countries that are less than 50% urbanized. This shows the connection between GDP and income across countries in the world. There's no path that we know of out of poverty into prosperity for the developing world that doesn't involve building large amounts of cities. In the U.S., if the rest of America became as productive per capita as the New York metropolitan area, our GDP would rise by 43%. Okay, there's a massive gulf in productivity between our large metropolitan areas and our smaller areas, and this shows the graph between the relationship between output per worker and area size. And of course, the success of cities is shown in rising real estate prices. It's shown in a rise of reverse commuting. It's shown in the rise of population in cities like New York. Now, why is this going on? Why is it that the fact that the cyberseers and techno-prophets who predicted that our cities would become obsolete, who predicted that the fact that we could all telecommute in from our electronic cottages, I think that was Alvin Toffler's phrase, why hasn't that come to pass? I think the fundamental reason for this is that what globalization and new technologies have done is that they've increased the returns to being smart. A good idea is more valuable than ever because you can sell it on the other side of the planet, you can make it in China, you can find enormous opportunities throughout the world. Now, we are at our heart a social species. We get smart by being around other smart people, right? That's why we're all here. That's why NYU is here. And that's also why New York is here. Right? The fundamental function of a city like New York in the 21st century is to connect smart people and enable them to learn from one another. That function is not getting less important over time. It's getting more important over time. And as much as we can have electronic meetings of various forms, it's not a substitute for face-to-face contact, both because the most complicated, the most intense, the most important ideas are still best transferred face-to-face. Anyone who teaches knows the problem with teaching is not actually knowing your own stuff. It's not knowing your own material. That's easy. That you get by the time you're done with your PhD. The thing that you need to know is whether or not the people that you're talking to get it. Are you actually communicating it across? And that's one of the reasons why face-to-face contact is so important. A second reason, of course, is that face-to-face contact allows those happenstance, unexpected occurrences that provide us with so much information. If you think about young workers who come to Wall Street or come to Silicon Valley, what they're learning from the people around them is not what's happening in formal training sessions. That's by and large irrelevant. It's the fact that they get to watch the people who are older than they are and smarter than they are. They get to watch how they succeed. Just as importantly, they get to watch them screw up. Right? And those little bits of learning, which I'm sure all of you have experienced in your lives, are what fuels the rise of cities like New York as centers of the information age. Now, none of this was so obvious when I was a kid growing up in this city in the 1970s. So if you turn the clock back to 1977, it looked like not just President Ford, but history itself was telling New York to drop dead. That was the first effect that changes in transportation technology had on the city. After all, cities like New York, like Chicago, these are the famous stockyards, formed around transportation nodes. They formed around ports, around harbors, around the rail yards that those cows were being slaughtered to be taken upon. New York's three industries that dominated in the 19th century were all based around the port: sugar refining, garment production, and printing and publishing. Printing and publishing, of course, because the great money in 19th century books was printing pirated English novels, like those of Sir Walter Scott. And having access to the port meant that the Harper brothers could publish first before their Philadelphia competitors, Carey and Lee, got this. Garment production, obviously, as well, was built around the port, built around the supply in of textiles and those ships that would then take, ships and then rail that would then take the finished products out. But in the 1950s, garment production in New York was the largest industrial cluster in the country. And the backdrop for that Ford to New York drop dead was the complete eradication of that industry. Doesn't mean that New York doesn't still produce ideas for fashion that are then manufactured throughout the world, but it doesn't produce many garments themselves anymore. Now, in some sense, the great epic of 20th century American cities was Detroit. Right? A city that was also formed around waterways, formed around transportation networks. In fact, every one of the 20 largest American cities in 1900 was built around a waterway. What you're seeing here is a picture of Detroit Dry Dock, a great engine company featuring the brilliant engineer Frank Kirby, which provided the initial engine training for young Henry Ford. Right? It was natural that Detroit would actually end up having cars because, in fact, Detroit brought together the carriage business based on Michigan's wood and the engine business based on the port. Detroit in 1900 looked a lot like Silicon Valley in the 1970s. There were smart, entrepreneurial people, people on every street corner. The Fisher brothers, David Dunbar Buick, Billy Durant nearby in Flint, and Ford himself, all of whom were borrowing each other's ideas, supplying each other with inputs, supplying each other with financing. They created this enormous industrial cluster. The great tragedy, of course, with Detroit is that it then lost what made the city fertile. Cities succeeded in the 18th century by having small firms, smart people, and access to the outside world. That's how they succeed again today. But the industrial model was different. And it succeeded by having vast firms, vast enterprises like Ford's River Rouge plant, that were essentially cut off from the outside world and that specialized in providing good wages to less educated people. That proved to be a very bad model for long-run urban sustainability. And as cities like Detroit lost their transportation cost advantages because transportation costs plummeted, and what you're looking at here is the real cost of moving a ton a mile by rail over the 20th century. And rail obviously is only a small part of the overall transportation innovations that occurred. But whereas it was expensive to move goods in the 19th century, it cost as much to move goods 32 miles over land in 1816 as it did to ship them across the Atlantic. Right? So the whole world perched around the waterways. Through the 20th century, those transportation costs plummeted, and you could move your manufacturing out. You could move your manufacturing to right-to-work states, to China, wherever you had a cost advantage. And producing low-cost products is never going to come back to our older cities. This industrial model is gone. What happened as a result of the decline in transportation costs is that you had this tremendous move to sun and sprawl. Right? No variable better predicts urban growth in the 20th century than January temperature. Right? Enormously powerful predictor of what places add population. What you're looking at here is change in population 1950 to 2000 by quintile of January temperature. As you notice, the 20% of those metropolitan areas that are in the warmest category grew by more than double the rate of the less warm places. There are many factors that come together for that. It's not just trying to escape the snow and the cold, but certainly the move to warmth. One of the things that was going on was that people were moving to places that they found more comfortable, aided in part by things like air conditioning. We also remade our housing stock. We remade our cities, right? It's an old line in urban economics that cities reflect the dominant transportation in the era in which they're built. The oldest parts of New York and Boston have the windy streets and the chaotic corridors that are natural pedestrian transit. The somewhat newer areas are built around the omnibus, built around grids, built around things that early public transportation made possible. And in the 20th century, as we moved to cars for understandable, if problematic reasons. The average commute by car is 24 minutes in this country. The average commute by public transit is 48 minutes. We remade our society around the car. Each new highway that cut into a central city reduced its population by 18% relative to the metropolitan area. And first we built suburbs like Levittown, the relatively cookie-cutter early example of great post-war suburbanization. And now we build things like the Woodlands outside of Texas, which is a considerably more luxurious and designed form of space. These are important to recognize because this is the challenge that those people who want to build in the city have to face, right? This is our competition to a certain extent. The impact of this was that all of the older, colder cities, with the exception of New York, lost substantial amounts of population between 1950 and 2000. Three of them, St. Louis, these were the 10 largest cities in 1950. Three, St. Louis, Cleveland, and Detroit, lost 50% of their population or more, just a complete hollowing out of these cities. Some of them, like Boston or Chicago, managed to get away with only losing 20% of their population. And New York, miracle of miracles, actually gained, which is it's important to remember how special New York is. The decline of cities like Detroit was aided in part by the social distress. This is the '67 riot, which destroyed more than 2,000 buildings in the city. And also, the policy response to this decline was completely mistaken, right? The federal government stood there ready to finance structures in declining places, stood there ready to finance urban renewal, and stood there ready to finance transportation infrastructure, when the last thing a declining city needs is more structures, right? The hallmark of a declining city is it's got a lot of structures relative to people. Detroit doesn't need a people mover going over essentially empty streets. Okay, you've got perfectly good ways of getting around rather than taking this monorail, right? And yet the federal government decided they wanted to create a Disneyland in Detroit for some reason and put a monorail there. Cities came back. The cities like New York and Boston and Minneapolis came back not because of great federal boondoggles, but because of smart people who exploited the fact that the same proximity that once got hogsheads onto clipper ships now enables smart people to learn from one another. I love the Bloomberg example because he's played so many different roles, now mayor. On one level, Bloomberg's important because he's a part of a chain of innovation that occurred in New York in finance. Now, cities have always created chains of innovation where smart people learn from one another, right? Think about the Renaissance painting in Florence where Brunelleschi teaches Donatello, who teaches Fra Filippo Lippi, who teaches Botticelli, and so on. Smart people learning from one another. Well, this happens in finance as well, right? A more sophisticated ability to think about the trade-off between risk and return enables Henry Kravis to sell high-yield debt, which enables Michael Milken to sell high-yield debt, which enables Henry Kravis to finance LBOs. And Lou Ranieri fits in this in securitization. And Bloomberg, of course, is selling the data terminals that enable this more sophisticated trade-off between risk and return to be utilized. But Bloomberg is an important symbol of something else that goes on in cities, which is the ability of large, dense areas to enable cross-industry fertilization. He's an IT entrepreneur, but he comes out of finance. Unlike any software engineer sitting in Silicon Valley, he knew exactly what the traders at Merrill needed. And it's that knowledge that enabled him to succeed wildly in the IT business. It's that knowledge that he learned in New York. The third thing that I like about this, of course, is he's imported the bullpen, this model that's borrowed from trading floors, like the trading floor that he ran at Salomon Brothers, where some of the wealthiest people on the planet eschew large offices to be right on top of each other. They want to be right on top of each other because knowledge matters so much, because information is so valuable. And that, in some sense, is the city writ small, okay? It's a symbol of why so many knowledge-intensive industries are willing to pay to be in New York, because the high rents in this area are made up for by the fact that there is no industry where knowing a better piece of information is more valuable than finance. If we want to think about which ones of the older, colder cities came back, then now I'm getting, of course, to smart cities, although it's sort of my take on smart cities, not necessarily the conference's take, that there's nothing that's more predictive of urban reinvention than skills. What you're looking at here is the relationship between population growth in the Northeast and the Midwest and the share of the population with a college degree in 1970, okay? The skill level of the population is the determinant of which cities were able to come about, in part because this great urban advantage, the ability to learn from one another, the ability to teach from one another, is much more valuable when you have educated people in the city. So skills ended up being the critical ingredient in urban comebacks. This is the relationship between the share of skilled workers in a population and what economists call a wage residual. So the wage residual is your wages controlling for your education and your experience. So we're basically correcting for the nationwide impact of skills, and we're asking how much do your wages go up as you work around more skilled people in your metropolitan area. And the fact is, holding your education constant, as the share of the population in your metropolitan area with college degrees increases by 10%, your wages go up by 8%. Okay? It's also important to note that people who come to skilled cities don't experience huge wage gains overnight. What they experience is a faster rate of wage growth, which I think is most compatible with the view that cities are forges of human capital. They're places that enable us to learn and become skilled over time. And it's precisely because those skills are getting more, not less important, that cities like New York, I think, remain quite powerful. This also shows that the places that started with skill advantages only got more skilled. So what you're looking at here is the change in the share of the population with college degrees between 1940 and 1960 regressed on the initial share of the population with college degrees. That a slight advantage in 1940 translated to a huge advantage in 2000, which I think only emphasized the importance of skills. Education is, of course, the dominant player in determining the unemployment during the current recession. So what you're looking at here is education and the unemployment rates in 2010. The effect at the city level is stronger, significantly stronger than the effect that's just predicted by the fact that the average unemployment rate for people who are college graduates is less than 5%, and the unemployment rate for high school dropouts is 15%. This effect is actually too strong, which suggests that educated people are having some sort of effect on the overall level of entrepreneurship in the city. Entrepreneurship also matters. 50 years ago, Ben Chinitz wrote about why New York seems so resilient relative to Pittsburgh, and he argued that the garment industry, which was a very small firm industry, had created a culture of entrepreneurship, skills in starting new firms that enabled the city to be far more resilient than big firm U.S. Steel Pittsburgh. It turns out there's statistics that lie behind this, that the average firm size in a metropolitan area or a county is a very strong predictor of its job growth over the next 30 years. And you want to just think of the people in New York who came out of the garment industry, people like Sandy Weil, for example, great entrepreneur, part of the finance. His father was a garment entrepreneur originally. A. Lefcourt, right, the great builder whose story I discuss in my book, right, who built more skyscrapers than anyone else in New York prior to the Great Depression, before he, in a famous piece of over-optimism, declared that he was sure 1930 would be a great building year. But Lefcourt came out of the garment industry as well. Now, the success of cities like New York hinges not just upon productivity, the productivity that comes from skilled workers, but also on quality of life. Right? A mobile population demands high levels of amenities. And cities like New York have come back in part because they're fun and they're healthy in a way that they never were in the past. A child born in New York in 1900 could expect to live 7 years less than a child born elsewhere in the nation. Today, New York enjoys a 2-year life expectancy advantage. Probably among older people, that has something to do with walking and perhaps social connections. Among younger people, it's quite easy. It's about lower levels of suicide and lower levels of motor vehicle accidents. It's just taking the subway while tipsy is just a lot less dangerous than driving drunk. And suicides remain a fascinating fact, that people in cities, even though they don't typically declare themselves to be happier, are much less prone to actually taking their own lives. This shows the relationship between an amenity index, which is based just on housing prices and incomes, and subsequent population growth. Obviously, our population is mobile, and it does value places that are pleasant. I'm going to skip over congestion pricing and move on to real estate. So the New York, like other cities, successful skilled cities, manages to come back buoyed by quality of life, by the fact that New York is fun as well as productive, by its restaurants, by its cultural scene, and above all by its wages. But as it comes back, it then runs up against a brick wall. And the brick wall was that it was becoming increasingly difficult to build in the city. So what you're looking at here is two lines. The line that's going down in circles until the early years of this decade shows the number of permits in Manhattan. Okay? That hits its peak in the 50s, 60s. Of course, it's post-1920s peak when it was really huge. And then the line with triangles shows rising housing prices. Now, this is an amazing thing, right? That just when demand for New York was going through the roof, New York was permitting less and less housing. And there are many reasons for this, but most of all, it's regulatory. right? Above all, it's the 61 zoning code and the enormously strong restrictions that it puts on building. It's the growth in historic preservation districts. Today, 15% of the land south of 96th Street that's not in parks is in a preservation district in this country, and in the city, in the island of Manhattan. And while, I certainly join those who believe that preserving the architectural monuments of our past is important, one can wonder whether all that many glazed brick post-war buildings should be protected. Housing supply, the rules that impact housing, play a very large role in shaping America today, and it's a role that's largely under-examined. And it's one of the reasons why I wrote this book, is to try and force more of a dialogue about the rules that actually make building more difficult than it should be. What you're looking at here, and I've cut it off before the boom really gets crazy, but what you're looking at here is along the x-axis, along the horizontal axis, is the amount of building in a metropolitan area between 2000 and 2005. Along the y-axis is the median housing value as of 2005. Now, if you thought that the only thing that differed, this is taking you back to Economics 101, but if you thought the only thing that differed across metropolitan areas was demand for some places being more productive than others, you'd expect to see a line that would go away out from the origin, just a moving out cluster of cities where the high demand ones would see lots of building, okay, and high prices. But that's not what you see. The places with high prices don't build a lot, and the places that build a lot don't have high prices. That is only compatible with a view that supply is just very, very different in places like Phoenix and Las Vegas and places like San Jose and San Francisco, okay? And this is, these forces are actually shaping where this country moves. If we want to understand why Texas has added more people than any other since the last has added so many people since the last census, it's impossible to understand that without understanding the building regulations that leave Texas builders relatively untroubled, relative to what's happened in California since the 1960s that has become more and more restrictive over time. This is the relationship between the Wharton Residential Land Use Regulatory Index and home prices. Unsurprisingly, more regulated places are much more expensive, right? Even if you do believe that we need, preservation districts that are large or other barriers to building, at least you need to recognize that the impact of those things is to create a more expensive, less inclusive city that threatens to become a boutique available only to the very wealthy. And this is the relationship between permitting and local land use regulation. This shouldn't be a surprise. This is the distribution of minimum lot sizes across space in Greater Boston. The average minimum lot size is an acre across these areas, and there's plenty of minimum lot sizes that are over 2 acres in the area, right? Minimum lot sizes obviously restrict building. How could they not, right? You're saying how many houses can be built on a certain amount of land. And in some sense, the restrictions on building are tragic because they make it so difficult to exploit such a sensible, natural way of housing humanity, right? Which is building up in New York. Building up is just a way of accommodating more people. It's a way of making the city more inclusive. And it's also a great, allows one of the greatest public transportation tools ever invented, the elevator, to be used to get people around. And, I love the story of the skyscraper, and I tell it in my book, in part because it's not just skyscrapers aren't just an important part of urban form, but they're also an invention of the city, of course. This idea of cities having these chains of innovation could not be more clearly shown than in the murky ancestry of the idea of the skyscraper. William LeBaron Jenney is customarily given credit for inventing it, but of course the home insurance building, which you see there, only has 2 walls with load-bearing skeletons, right? The back walls are traditional masonry, traditional load-bearing walls. And he's clearly enmeshed in a group of just brilliant architects in Chicago, attracted there by the opportunities after the Great Fire, learning from each other, stealing each other's ideas, coming up with a new thing, Jenney to Burnham to Sullivan to Root to Adler and so forth, just a remarkable array of smart people who came up with this, dramatic way of housing people. And yet, this is a particular condo sample in New York. This shows the share of units in buildings taller than 20 stories based on the decade in which the building was built. And as you can see, those buildings got shorter in the 70s and 80s than they had been, in the 80s and 90s than they had been in the 70s. New York was making it more difficult to build up. I think that this is actually one of the, there's a huge amount in Jane Jacobs that I admire. I think she got this one wrong, just profoundly wrong. I mean, she famously opposed the NYU library on Washington Square. I think she was wrong on that one. And I'm not just saying that because I'm your guest. And she was also profoundly wrong on her logic on new and old buildings and preservation. She looked at the buildings around her and noticed that old buildings were cheap and new buildings were expensive. So lo and behold, this convinced her that, well, what you do to make New York affordable is you preserve the old buildings and don't let anyone build new ones. Well, guess what? That's not how supply and demand works, okay? If you restrict building to a lot of old, low-density buildings, you make the city more, not less expensive. The only way to accommodate demand is to deliver more supply. And her own home neighborhood of Greenwich Village, which was affordable to her in 1950, as a middle-income, household with her and her architect husband, it was not affordable. What middle-income household can afford Greenwich Village in 2011, right? It's become a province of just that sort of townhome is available only to the extremely rich. I want to end, since we are talking about the environment, with a little anecdote and just a little bit of evidence on cities and the environment. In a lovely spring day in 1844, a young Harvard College graduate and a friend went for a walk and a picnic and some fishing in the woods outside of Concord. The fishing was good because there hadn't been much rain lately, and after they caught some fish, they proceeded to cook a chowder. The wind flicked the flames from their fire to the nearby tall grass, and the flames spread, creating a great fiery conflagration that turned into an inferno that at the end of the day burned down more than 300 acres of prime Concord woodland. In his day, this young Harvard graduate was known as a great enemy of the environment. Right? The Concord Freeman called him a flibbertigibbet, which, as far as I know, is damning in the world of 1844. Of course, today, he is a secular saint of modern environmentalism. That young, inadvertent arsonist was, of course, Henry David Thoreau. Now, I tell Henry David Thoreau's story for a reason, because it makes a larger point. We humans, we're a destructive species. We tend to destroy things that we're around. And if you love nature, stay away from it, because you're going to do it a lot of harm, just like Henry David Thoreau did, who did more harm to the woods outside of Concord than anyone I can think of in Boston living during his time period. Now, there's data that goes along with this, of course. Together with UCLA environmental economist Matthew Kahn, we've tried to measure carbon emissions associated with living in different parts of the country, standardizing for income and family size. And unsurprisingly, we find that people who live in large cities are having significantly lower carbon emissions than people who live outside of cities. About a significant portion of that is from less driving, and the other portion is from just smaller households. Even holding constant the number of people in the household, obviously people in cities occupy less space, and that becomes greener. And that's, as we think about sort of smart cities and sustainable development, it's important to remember that building tall buildings in New York or Hong Kong or Mumbai isn't just green if they're LEED certified, if the actual running of the building is green, although that certainly also makes them greener. They're also green because they just allow people not to drive 30 miles to get to work. They're green by their very essence, by being in a dense urban area. And in some sense, there's nothing really much greener than blacktop. And I think one of the odd things is that whereas I would have hoped that environmentalists would be, the biggest friends of builders who are constructing housing in environmentally sustainable areas, that has rarely happened. I'll just show a simple, this is looking at emissions across metropolitan areas. And I'm showing the relationship between that Wharton Regulation Index and the degree to which there are carbon emissions associated with different metro areas. And what you notice here is that the lowest carbon emission areas in the country are those in coastal California. And the reason for that is not, less driving. It's just temperature. It's just that they live in an enormously benign temperature in terms of both heating and cooling. And if you thought that the environmental activists were focused on reducing our global carbon footprint, what they should be doing is championing every bit of new development on the San Francisco Bay that they can. Right? That is actually the most sustainable thing that they could be doing, right? Because that would involve less building. I mean, you can't affect the total amount of home building that happens in America. You can just determine whether or not it's going to occur in your backyard or somewhere else. And when you turn off a spigot in San Francisco or in Berkeley or in San Jose, it turns on outside of Houston. It turns on outside of Phoenix. And pushing building away from low carbon areas to high carbon areas increases our carbon footprint. And I certainly hope to see a reawakening of a pro-building, pro-development movement in greater San Francisco, as perhaps less than realistic that view may be. The big battles, though, on the environment and on green cities will occur in the great markets of the developing world, right? All the action in terms of global carbon emissions is what happens in India and China, right? Especially since particularly India has a climate that is, if anything, worse than Houston's in terms of making the need for air conditioning enormous. Right. I've also, with Matthew Kahn, gone around and estimated carbon emissions associated with living in different cities in China. And what you notice in China is that the bigger dots show the higher carbon intensive areas, is that because China is at an early stage of its development, it heats but it doesn't cool, much as America did 60 or 70 years ago. So in fact, the greenest cities are the ones in the south, not in the north, and an opposite pattern to the US. The other thing that's important is that household carbon emissions coming from residences and driving are 1/20th on average the US level. So there's just enormous scope for change to occur in China. And if China develops something that looks like New York, looks like Shanghai, that looks like high-density pedestrian and skyscraper-oriented building, the whole world is going to be a lot safer, I think, if you think that global warming is an issue, than if it builds things that looks like suburban sprawl in the US. I think the biggest warning signs on this, though, are actually in India. I think the Chinese certainly have a belief in the large scale of urban areas. India, however, has pursued benighted land use policies for close to 50 years, right? And for many decades, the floor area ratio the maximum in floor area ratio in Mumbai was 1 1/3 throughout much of the city. This is insane in a city that is providing India with a path out of poverty, right? Gandhi famously said that the future of India lies in its towns and villages, not in its cities. I'm paraphrasing. He was, of course, completely wrong, right? The future of India is in its cities, right? It's those cities that are providing the gateways between India and the rest of the world. From our perspective, Bangalore may seem like it's on the end of nowhere and just has a lot of call centers. From an Indian perspective, it's the quintessence of proximity. It's where smart young Indians come to get educated, and Mumbai plays a similar role, which is what makes it so tragic that India has restricted the growth of its urban dynamos. And as you look forward to the future of Mumbai, I think there's no area where I'd like to see more lobbying for constructing high-density, sky-rise, pedestrian-oriented buildings than in Mumbai, both because it sets a model for sustainable urban development, but also because it raises the possibility of bringing more Indians together and enabling them to enjoy the fruits of prosperity. So let me stop now for questions, and thank you all for your attention. Yes, sir.
The first thing you said is that cities, because of smart people and all this, that the social networking phenomenon doesn't affect the value of cities. And you didn't prove that to me. Because the whole value of cities as a place to aggregate has been there forever. That's sort of the history of cities. So explain to me again why social networking doesn't make some areas outside of cities more valuable.
It is certainly possible that some areas outside of cities will benefit, but cities as a whole have also historically benefited from this. So let's go through a couple of pieces, and I can take you through basically 5 pieces of evidence on this if we want to go through it. Okay, so starting point, let's look at the historical record. So this is hardly the first innovation in long-distance communication, right? It's nothing relative to the printing press. Nothing, okay? It's even modest relative to the telephone. Okay. All of these previous innovations, even though the printing press enabled people to learn at long distances, even though people argued that the telephone would be, this great boon to rural life, right? All of these things became part of creating an urban world, right? The book was involved in creating political change that led to a move away from agrarian monarchies to urban societies like Holland. The telephone was involved in creating a more interactive, more communicative, ultimately more urban area. Across countries, of course, telephone use is associated with more urbanization, not less. Across people who meet face-to-face are much more likely to use telephones than not to use telephones. So we have this historical record, and of course, it was claimed that things like faxes and telephones would make business travel obsolete as well, because these are a tangible measure of face-to-face interactions. The rise of new information technologies starting in the 70s and 80s was also associated with a massive increase in the amount of business travel, even controlling for the prices of that business travel. Second piece of information, look at industrial patterns and who actually urbanizes and who doesn't. It is telling that the industry in the U.S. that has the most ability to use long-distance communication is also the most famous example of geographic clustering of any industry in the country, right? That Silicon Valley, right, is this industry that specializes in allowing people to connect at long distances. But where do they want to be? Right on top of each other. They all want to be in the darn Googleplex, right? Sitting right next to each other and learning at each other from close proximity. We see this in the fact that the urban wage premium has gone up over time, and that the urban the premium associated with skills being in cities have actually gone up over time as well. We see this in experimental evidence. where we give people an opportunity to engage in collaborative ventures. And if they've just connected electronically, they do significantly worse at this than if they've actually connected face-to-face. So I think there's just a lot of evidence that makes this, that it, to me, builds a relatively persuasive case for it. But I admit, we're gazing into a crystal ball, and we can only see what we've seen. But if you went back to the 1970s and you thought about what you expected to see, you would be, totally overwhelmed by the view that, look, it's a decentralizing force. All of this globalization, cars, new technology is just going to kill off New York. But the point is that New York didn't die at all, and that, I guess, is the last thing that we've actually observed. We've lived through it. We lived through these technologies enabling cities to come back. Okay, another question. Yes, sir.
What do you have to say about city governments and how they gravitate towards excessive regulation? It always seems to be that way, that there's smart people who know what you want to do, and regulatory agencies that are resistant.
I think there are multiple things going on there. To a certain extent, there is, of course, just a natural tendency of any political body to grab more power over time and to increase its reach. After all, they have to seem to be doing something. But I think in the case of particularly housing regulation, it reflects something even deeper, which is that the neighbors usually don't want the construction. Right? The neighbors typically, particularly homeowning neighbors, not business neighbors, typically would rather avoid the inconvenience of building housing near them. So in fact, if I talk to my friends who are either in New York, either someone like Amanda Burden, or if I talk to the Boston, my friends in the BRA, right, they'll tell you they're doing as much to allow building as the community groups will actually let them do. Now, I'm not sure we want to believe all that, but that's certainly what they will claim, and it certainly is. If you just remember the fracas about Tom Wolfe leading the charge on the Sotheby Park Barnett Madison building, right? The community can be very powerful in opposing new construction. And that's not surprising. We don't have a great means of compensating them. They do lose a little bit. But the problem is that whereas the people who are currently neighbors of the new construction are there ready to have their voices heard, the new people, right, who would come in, who would benefit from the construction, they're not there. They're not at the table. Right? They're not being represented. So it seems as if, well, I've got 500 people nearby, all of whom don't want this skyscraper to go up, right? And I've got maybe 500 people who would benefit from the skyscraper, but they're not at the table. And I think that inevitably pushes things too much against new construction. I give high marks to Mayor Daley, right, who actually understood that his own city needed space, needed building up in this. And I think, that's what makes strong, effective leaders so necessary, is that they're able to actually think about the people who are not at the table and who are not represented by the near neighbors of the new construction. Yes, sir.
What do you think would be the social and economic impact if the 1.5 million apartments in New York that are regulated were released to market?
I'm an economist, so it goes without saying that I'm not a huge fan of rent control. We certainly would see a whole lot of political unhappiness. That's certainly true. But it's hard to think of. There's a great line by Asser Lindbeck. Maybe John Quigley will remember it. But short of bombing, there's no tool that's better known to destroy a city than imposing rent control, and I'm paraphrasing Quigley's view. It's remarkable that New York has done as well as it has, in fact, despite this long-term problem. So I think certainly we do want to think about reforming this area and allowing prices to clear the market. And if we want to help the people who have less income live in New York, we've got a good tool for that. They're called housing vouchers, right? It's a way that actually respects the market, and there's no reason why we need to be cold-hearted about this, even though we respect the ability of the free market to work on this. So that's certainly at least my, the way I tend to think about this. Yes, sir.
Peter Miskovich, we'd like to know if you have any data that shows the correlation of information technology investment and infrastructure investment into wealth creation, prosperity, and potentially sustainable practices. And I'm pointing to even an article in today's New York Times on Korea as an example, heavily investing in ICT technologies throughout the country. Any correlation for New York as we look, over the next 30 years around our infrastructure, our information technology infrastructure, and what will that mean in terms of wealth creation and long-term sustainability?
So there certainly are correlations between various forms of infrastructure and subsequent success along different margins. Some of the older work on this was actually just equipment investment. So Larry Summers actually wrote a paper about 20 years ago showing a relationship between equipment investment and long-run growth. I think part of the reason why this work hasn't gotten a lot of academic traction is that equipment or IT investment isn't random, right? So places typically invest in these things when they're going to be growing for other reasons. And while I'd like to be able to tell you that I'm confident that the impact of $1 billion worth of IT investment in the city yields an increase in productivity of 34%, I think that's actually hard to say. But certainly, IT connections are clearly important, and they're, again, it sort of works with my general theme that information technology is a complement to the face-to-face connections that exist in cities, not something for cities to be afraid of as they go forward. I think we have time for maybe one more question. One more. Yes, sir.
As a native of Detroit, I couldn't agree more with what you said about the people mover and the incompatibility of that project with the city's revival. But I'm curious, do you have 2 or 3 ideas as to what would have saved Detroit in lieu of building that project?
I don't think there's anything that could have kept Detroit at 2 million people. I don't think that was remotely sustainable. I think the fundamental mistake, which was a mistake that was done all over the declining areas of this country, was to basically follow a Potemkin village strategy that said that we're going to put up some shiny new buildings, some Renaissance centers, and we're going to call that success. And as much as as much as we all believe in the importance of structures for making cities work, at their heart, cities are people. Right? And at their heart, urban policy needs to be dedicated to investing in making sure that every child growing up in Detroit has economic opportunity. So for me, at least, I think the right policy for Detroit would have been, in the 40s and 50s, doing much more to invest in the skills of the young people growing up in that city. And that was the sort of long-run investment that would have paid. Right? The one public investment we know that reaps very, very high returns at the city level was the presence of a land-grant college in that area prior to 1940. That land-grant colleges like MIT were incredibly successful. This is work of John's colleague Enrico Moretti. I've also done some stuff on this, and that education is really absolutely central to this. That being said, it's not easy to fix urban school systems, and certainly I couldn't be a bigger fan of what Joel Klein tried to do here in the city, and I couldn't be a bigger fan of his abilities and his energies. But it's very hard to move that dial, and it's certainly very, very hard to move that dial in Detroit. And I'll just, I guess, end on this, that I at least see considerable promise in the charter school movement, and I think a lot of the statistical work that has come out has shown significant effects for people who are literally randomized into charter schools. So you really can compare apples with apples in terms of forming these assessments. And this is particularly true in urban areas. Suburban charter schools have had less score success, and I think it's in part because charter schools, as do all forms of added competition in the education industry, play to what is central to cities, their ability to create competition and innovation. So if you think about why you can get a great meal in New York, it's because there's this constant flow of new restaurants, new eateries that are trying something new, coming up with some new idea, and half of them are failing, 3/4 of them are failing, but the ones that are succeeding are actually doing something good. Now imagine if instead you had handled all food in New York over to a central food superintendent sitting in City Hall, who would actually establish canteens that would feed you what he thought was good for you on a daily basis. This city would be, it would be like one of those old steel towns in Russia, not even Moscow. It would be one of those old steel towns in Russia at the worst period in the Stalinist era in terms of food quality. Now, there's a sense in which that's what we've done with schools. Right? We've actually handled schools over and closed off that remarkable ability of cities to innovate and compete. And I think creating more freedom in these areas, creating more possibility of just smart entrepreneurial people to try and fix this problem is what will enable us to get past it. Cities have a remarkable ability to come up with things that solve their own problems, from the skyscraper, which solved the need for space, to John Snow's figuring out how cholera worked by looking at the incidence of cholera in London, to Vickery, who came up with the idea of congestion pricing as he was working in New York to handle the excess of cars on crowded city streets. I believe that cities can do this in the education realm as well. But it needs to be a move that recognizes the greater ability to have bottom-up entrepreneurship and innovation and ideas, rather than thinking that we're going to, sit here and know the right answer and we're just going to flick a switch and make it happen, because I think we can be pretty confident that that's not going to work. So with that, let me thank you all very, very much for your attention.
All right, thank you, Professor. Important points to remember on the smart city. We're not just talking about technology, that the people are critical to this, and I think that'll be a common theme as we go through the rest of the day. I'd like to call up our first panel on buildings and design.